Chapter 11. Had Dr. Warner been in Davinia Portman's home that Sunday morning, he would have been able to tell Anna Lee exactly why the man died, that such and such artery had been severed, or that he'd been too far gone when he was found. As it was, Anna Lee could only sit on her corner pallet and watch the sunrise reverse itself on the wall opposite the window, its light shining first at the ceiling, then sliding down over the newspaper columns in the cabin's chinks, resting on the dead man's face, which drooped sideways on his shoulder in an attitude of having just taken a blow, and finally shrinking ever so slowly on the floor until it might have touched the hem of her dress if she'd moved. But she didn't move, so it only fell farther away. Anna Lee was alone with the man. Davinia hadn't said where she was going when she left with the boys and Mackie, but gave instructions for Anna Lee to try and get some rest as if she would be able to sleep. Anna Lee had started to massage her eyes in the places that burned, particularly the outer corners, before she remembered the blood that was still caked under her fingernails and in the cuticles. She tried to scratch it out for the better part of an hour, but the dried particles would not fall off completely. Now she just stared at the fingers and recalled the feel of their immersion in the man's blood, the warmth of the spurts that leaked out in ever-weakening pulses from one end of the vessel that she could not pinch tight enough. She'd wanted to try for a better hold on the ends, but had to fight the urge to let go of the slippery tissues for fear of losing them altogether. She would not think now of how much blood had spattered onto her dress front, nor of how much had soaked into the hem, as she stood in the puddle which the tightly packed dirt floor would not let seep down into the ground. She would have to burn the dress, for though she might eventually wash the blood from her hands, she would never wash it from the fabric. A full bottle of laudanum placed on one of the recessed shelves on the wall had reflected no sunlight when the beam had passed over it earlier in the morning. It merely stood still there, impenetrable in its brown glass, until the light left and it became black in the dimness of the shanty. Too late, the younger of Davinia's sons had drawn Benedict up at the door and brought in the laudanum. As expected, the doctor did not accompany the medicine. He had refused to come near the settlement until after daylight. Davinia had simply taken the laudanum from the boy's hand and set it up out of the way. She and her mute son placed the quilt back on the nails above the door while she listened to the child's story of his ride. Miss Warner had a good horse, he said, because he didn't flinch once at having a strange rider. They'd passed unseen through the town until they reached the doctor's house, where his wife wondered aloud if the horse was stolen, while the doctor gave instructions on the laudanum's administration. Anna Lee felt an urge to slap that woman, but the urge passed quickly into nothing. She wondered now whether Benedict had been unsaddled on the boy's return, or had been left to endure the irritation of a hasty fitting. She didn't feel like getting up to look. She thought then of what might have happened had Teague been there with her, his pill case full of opiate. Would he have been able to part with only a smidgen to sprinkle into the wound or onto the dying man's tongue? She doubted it, but wished for the case all the same. And then she dozed and dreamed of Teague, of Rebecca and John, of Tom, and now of this man with no name. Anna Lee kept her eyes closed for a few minutes after the dreams had ended, and listened to the occasional trickle of water in a bucket. She did not move from her position against the wall, even when she did open her eyes, to watch Davinia wash the dead man's face. "What was his name?" Anna Lee asked. Davinia dipped her rag again and shook her head. "I never seen him before in my life, but I expect he was the one I was looking out for. Come up from Kentucky. Crossed that whole state, I hear. Headed for family in Canada." She pushed the rag over the man's chest. "He was a young one, and prized, too. Not a mark on him." Anna Lee got up from the floor and stood closer to the table. "You'll want something to eat before you go. All I can give you is the rest of the biscuits," Davinia said. "I'm not hungry." She was ashamed of acknowledging the tightness in her stomach. "You will be before long, but suit yourself. I had the boys saddle your horse." Anna Lee started to protest that she could stay to see the man buried. Instead, she took a biscuit from the plate and walked out of the shanty. Monday, 20 October 1862. Felt well enough to eat some cold beef this morning. It tasted good, much better than the gruel they've been giving me in any case. It seems like such a very long time since I've wanted to eat anything. Miss Mary was most impressed with me this morning. She says I shall have as much chicken as I can stand at the noonday meal. I asked that it might be fried, and she said she would see it done if she has to do it herself. Miss Pennon gave me a book just now, and says I should keep my mind occupied. I considered telling her that mine don't get much more occupied than mine is, but for courtesy's sake I thanked her instead. It is a collection of Shakespeare. King Lear, Romeo and Juliet, Twelfth Night, and Much Ado About Nothing. 2 tragedies and 2 comedies. I'm tempted to say with Benedict there's a double meaning in that. The fellow with the right hand gone, who was 3 beds down from me, had this book before it passed to me. He died in his sleep a couple of days ago. I wish I knew what play he read before breathing his last. A comedy or a tragedy. Teague's head ached so much from his sleepless night and the demands of keeping the home guard in check that he was beginning to feel nauseated by the time the noonday sun and the striking of the clock in the telegrapher's office warned him that a rush of ladies fresh from a goodwill-inspiring round of Sunday sermonizing was imminent. He took refuge in the upstairs room of the doctor's office, not only because neither Dr. Warner nor Sam Etheridge was likely to use it today, but also because it afforded a good view of the North Road. He had been thinking all the while a mighty fortress was coming from the church building in tones of sopranos and altos, but nary a tenor or bass. How he missed the warlike dissonance Annalee's voice would have brought to the song about God the bulwark and the chosen winner of battles. Marcus and Johnny had returned from their search with no indication that anyone up that way had seen her. Dr. Warner had risked leaving the town without medical know-how to mount a horse and look for his daughter early that morning, but had yet to come back. It was inconceivable that she should so completely disappear, but Teague was certain that at any event she could take care of herself. The moment he'd met her in that patched dress and worn brogans amidst the finery of her mother's parlor, he'd known she was not suited to dependency, as were so many women of his acquaintance. That was one reason he couldn't understand her insistence on maintaining a faith that demanded resting her burdens on the Savior. It would be nice, he allowed, not to be always weighed down, but he'd long since discovered there was no getting rid of his cares. He watched the road and thought of her until he was reasonably sure enough time had passed for the ladies to lose their motivation to do good and to give up searching for him. Then he left the office, checked with the telegrapher for any new wires, and helped himself to a few of the wild onions growing in the grass along the sidewalk. A year ago, he would have been on campaign, thinking he would never eat another wild onion when he left the army. But for some reason, now he craved them over all the chicken pies and new potatoes the women of Newkirk could muster. While Teague sat on the steps in front of the building that housed both the telegrapher's office and the newspaper as kin in communication, Caleb Logan approached from across the street, fingering the watch chain dangling from his waistcoat pocket. "Good afternoon, Captain. It's a hot one." Teague nodded and continued rubbing the dirt from the head of his last onion. "Any word on Miss Warner?" Logan asked. "Not yet." "Well, they'll find her soon enough. How many do you have out looking for her?" "I sent out 2 men from each patrol." "She is something, I'll tell you that. I ran a column a while back about her and the other ladies sewing worn uniforms and sending them back good as new." Logan seemed to wait for a response that never came, and then sat down on the step beside Teague. "Yes, around here we take great interest in our fighting men. Like with this defense we're putting up. It's all a man hears about wherever he goes. And you, Captain Scott. I don't know if you realize, but you've become quite the celebrity." When Teague still didn't answer, but instead bit into his onion, Logan kept talking. "People would just love to know all about you. You know something?" Logan stopped long enough to put on a show of deliberation over something he'd probably decided well before he came to Teague. "If you could write something about your experiences, how you were raised, what you've seen. They'd pay good money to read it. I could get you 85 cents a column, provided, of course, it's written well enough, and I get a chance to edit it. No. Wait now, hear me out. We all have a great deal of respect for what you've done here. The people like Brighton well enough, but we both know he wasn't up for the job. He's just not a professional. You, though, you come by it naturally. Teague stared at Logan. They respect me because I was a soldier. And because you're still soldiering with just the one leg. You got Brighton's bunch organized, well, like McClellan would have done it. Teague wiped away a bead of sweat before it ran into his eye, and looked out on the cornfield in the middle of which was hidden Mrs. Rutger's nearly dry milk cow, bawling its position to any who cared to know. I can try you at $1, Logan said. Teague rose from the step. I'm afraid the lack of variety would lose your reader's interest. He started moving away. All I'm good for are soldiers' tales.